Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. I'd like to thank all members and witnesses for their attendance today in these very unusual circumstances. I thank our parliamentary staff, the clerks, and in particular the Broadcasting Office for all their hard work in setting up this remote first formal meeting of the committee. The committee recognises the very challenging times in which we're living, and we pay tribute to all of the organisations in the equalities and human rights sector for their continued dedicated service and hard work at this time. Now, the committee does not want to place undue pressure on these bodies during this public health emergency, but it is important that parliamentary scrutiny and accountability continues. I'm grateful, therefore, to the witnesses and others for finding the time to answer questions from the committee and for the way that they and other bodies have responded so quickly to our calls for views. Responses to our ongoing call for views are on the committee's website. Our main item of business this morning is an evidence session on how COVID-19 has impacted on equalities and human rights. We'll have two panels this morning. I'd like to welcome our witnesses on the first panel, Judith Robertson, Chair, Scottish Human Rights Commission, and Adam Statura, Head of Policy and Communications at Age Scotland. You're both very welcome. And if I can refer members to paper 1. Unusually, because of the challenges in managing a virtual meeting such as this, we're going to take questions today in a pre-arranged order. I'll shortly invite members to ask questions, and then I'll invite the witnesses to respond, also in a pre-arranged order. If you have nothing to add to a question or don't feel the need to speak, please simply state so. I'll then go back to each member for any follow-up questions. Once completed, I'll invite the next questioner and so on until the evidence session is concluded. I expect this panel's evidence session to last for no more than 1 hour. Please keep questions and answers succinct and give broadcasting a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your question or to provide an answer. And with all that said, we'll now move to questions. And if I may begin with a question to Judith Robertson, please. I'd like to ask about equalities and human rights assessments. I think at a time like now, where policy decisions are about balancing harm during this public health crisis, these are more important than ever. So with that in mind, can I ask Judith how the Commission contributed to the impact assessments in the coronavirus bills, if indeed they did? Judith.
Many thanks, Convener, for the opportunity to speak to the committee this morning. And in response to your question, I'm actually trying to remember the process. We contributed to aspects of the discussion in relation to the development of the bill and the development of the legislation. What our process was very much that the UK legislation came out very speedily, which gave us an opportunity to comment on the legislation and to raise the human rights concerns that were that arose from that process in order to inform the development of the Scottish legislation. We had, a conversation with Mike Russell, MSP, in advance of the Scottish legislation being developed. And I think we also had a conversation with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in relation to that. But as you will have seen from various aspects of our evidence and submissions that we've made, we have reiterated across government, not just in the development of legislation, but across government, of the importance of equality and human rights impact assessments and taking a human rights-based approach to the process of developing not just legislation, but policy and implementation in relation to the whole range of issues that are being impacted on in this current crisis. So, I mean, I can talk more about that as we go through the discussion if you want, but that's a short answer to your question.
Thank you. So I think you've covered some of it, Judith, but I suppose we'd be interested to hear your views on the Cabinet Secretary's comments that the Scottish Government is continuing to undertake equality impact assessments during this emergency period. Can you expand a bit on that, Judith?
To be perfectly honest, I wouldn't we wouldn't necessarily have seen equality impact assessments that the government have done on any area of policy. We have engaged in key areas, so we have engaged directly with the CMO's guidance in relation to aspects of delivering care, and we have, I'm trying to think what else we've engaged with directly. We've engaged directly with the CABSEC for Justice quite extensively around the prison rules. And that's been a very active conversation. I would say we've had 3 or 4 direct meetings with the CABSEC for Justice around both conditions in prisons, the number of prisoners, but we haven't. I'm just reflecting back. I'm aware that through the policing scrutiny process, we would have possibly seen an equality and human rights impact assessment, or at least an early draft of it. And that would have been as a result of being engaged in the Scottish Police Authority's independent advisory group to look at the police powers in relation to the corona crisis.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we now have legislative provision for inclusive communication, and I'd like to ask panel members, I think we'll come to Adam first, how we ensure that provision in legislation has an impact on people's lives right now. Adam.
That's a very, very good question. I think if we're looking through the lens of how older people particularly have been impacted by this crisis and the types of messaging and communication and actions that have been taken either by government, local authorities, the medical profession towards their care and support, it's been quite clear at the beginning of all of this that it was a bit, some of the messaging coming out was a bit cack-handed. Whether it was about DNAR, do not attempt resuscitation forms, for instance, or how people might be able to access medical treatment in the first sense. But what will be really important here is that people understand what everything means in the most simple way possible and making sure that it's not too technical. And I think one of the sort of lessons that we've learned at Age Scotland throughout all of this, now, as soon as this crisis hit and we started taking more extreme measures, we essentially moved our helpline function, the whole organisation, to supporting a national helpline for older people. It's one of the things that we do. But we had to decipher and translate information that was coming out, whether it was from the NHS or Scottish Government, because the calls we were getting from older people didn't understand what it meant to them. So quite a lot of effort has then gone into kind of reword things or try and make things clearer, and pick out the things that are important. I think broadly, though, the simple messaging that's come out, say, from government and NHS has been good, but people are quite interesting in that what we assume will be simple isn't always the case. So this extra effort is always taken to understand what everything the words mean, really, quite frankly.
Do you think that's about organisations or public bodies communicating in their own language, if you like? They'll have their own sort of, they're not necessarily thinking about the audience, but there's more of a focus on that. Adam?
I think I think that's a very good point. What I will say is that I think, broadly speaking, the Scottish Government's messaging at the beginning of this whole crisis was good. It was very simple, and there were simple instructions that people had to do. There's a lot of nuance around that, and obviously we've now in the last week heard of various people testing the nuances of what the advice and guidance might mean. But it was very interesting in looking at how the NHS would communicate internally, or the actions that they would take in terms of, let's look at do not attempt resuscitation forms, for instance. We had from end of March through to middle to end of April, initially quite a big influx of people getting phone calls from GPs and administrative staff and GPs asking them to sign up to DNAR forms. People didn't know what these things were. There was no instruction to ask people to do this. They weren't asked to do this, I don't think, by the government, according to conversations I've had with the Scottish Government. But these things happened, and it caused great confusion, fear and panic that people were just going to be written off. So I think the kind of what was meant with the best intention, actually when retranslated for the public, has been lacking.
Thank you, that's helpful. We'll now move on to questions from Deputy Convener Alex Cole-Hamilton. Alex.
Thank you, convener. Good morning to the panel. I'd like to start with a question directly to Judith Robertson, and then I've got one for Adam Sakura, if I may. So the Coronavirus Act, Schedule 9, covered mental health, as you know, and a number of groups raised concerns regarding the measures in the UK that were adopted in Scotland as well, which of course involve longer periods of emergency detention and making it simpler for securing short-term detention certificates. One of those measures, for example, was that you no longer needed two doctors to sign off on a section order to have somebody committed into psychiatric care or anything like that, or taken into psychiatric care. I wonder, Judith, first and foremost, if you could explain to us why those safeguards exist in the first place, and what you think the potential impact, albeit those powers we don't believe have been used as yet, what those the changes to those safeguards could mean from a human rights perspective.
Judith.
The safeguards are clearly there to protect people in relation to decisions being made about deprivation of liberty. These are very important issues, and obviously it's such an important point in someone's life that the safeguard is designed to add an additional layer of protection for individuals when their liberty is being effectively constrained. So the safeguard of having two practitioners there is to prevent any bias, any previous experience, a whole range of potential dynamics to be. It's a safeguard. It's to prevent that having undue influence on the process. So that's an important safeguard, and it's a safeguard that we didn't feel was necessarily justifiable, and didn't necessarily need to be brought into play, and did actually remove an important aspect to the process and decision making around the deprivation of liberty. And in our recommendations, we did suggest that be removed. In fact, as far as we're aware, the other aspect that we sought in relation to mental health was an important element of scrutiny of the decision-making processes, independent scrutiny of the decision-making processes. And we were pleased to see the Mental Welfare Commission both take up that role and be given that role by the government, and that they would be notified of decisions that were being made. And the Commission indeed joined the independent advisory group for the Mental Welfare Commission in order to support that process. In fact, it's not been used, and no notifications have been made to the Mental Welfare Commission in relation to those decisions. So where that group has been put on and ready to be reinstated if something happened. But in fact, while we were concerned about it and looked to see proper scrutiny measures put in place, which they were, we've been pleased that hasn't actually been brought into play.
Alex.
Thank you for that, Judith. Thank you, convener. If I can follow up on that, I think the provisions around, particularly that having two practitioners requiring sign-off for needs of having the ability to expedite a process, but also the perceived pressure that the whole health service might be under in the teeth of this emergency. As you say, that's not happened yet. And actually, we've seen that we've been able, thanks to the miraculous work of our NHS, to cope with this pandemic. Do you think in that context, then, there is an argument now to repeal those provisions because they've not been needed through the first peak, so arguably wouldn't be needed through a second peak? And indeed, given the pressure, the huge pressure this is having on mental health right across the country, from having people locked in their own homes for weeks at a time, that actually we need to be doing more to realise the rights of the people who may need our help.
Judith.
Sorry, thanks. I think, like all the aspects of the legislation that's put in place, it requires ongoing review, and there is a process for that within the legislative process. We would recommend that any measures which are no longer deemed relevant be stood down, and that the hope, one of the principles of taking action in relation from a human rights perspective is that they be proportionate, they be time limited, they be given a legislative basis, and they be for as short a time as possible. So from that perspective, yes, we would recommend they be withdrawn, particularly if, given the experience of this first phase of this pandemic, the government and services have really learned. They've learned so much about where the pressures lie in the system, where there are gaps, where there are weaknesses, and where there are strengths, and that's the learning that needs to be brought into play when those reviews are being undertaken by the government. And that needs to be very active, it needs to be very deliberate, but it needs to also be based on looking at things from a human rights perspective. And also we would also reiterate, and we've done this in many settings, the need for clear data, data which is gathered across the range of groups, both those with specific protected characteristics, but also data that reflects how that compounds a range of characteristics and the cumulative impact of processes on people, which would include obviously the impact on their mental health, because it's not just it's all sorts of things that are impacting people's mental health: economic circumstances, personal circumstances, family circumstances, etc. So there's a whole range of impacts there, and having the data to assess and be able to look at what has happened as a result of what we've done so far is really important part of the process.
Adam, do you wish to add anything on that topic?
I think it's quite difficult because there's so much behind this. I think when we look at where we are now against where there might be a perception that the country would be in, or the NHS or whatever public services, but thankfully we're not anywhere near that. Delighted the fact that NHS Louisa Jordan has no patients. That's something that we've got to be proud of. But looking and reviewing right now what is necessary and things that were kind of like put in place in the face of an emergency, which things could happen at any point, at any day. Probably a good point to kind of take stock and look at with the best advice and the best, if we're looking at decisions made on clinical advice, which seems to be the main thrust of the government's actions. Looking at the likelihood of needing these things in the future, just in case there could be the sort of powers that are there are ever misused, because it's quite hard to sort of roll back on things once they've started, or there's a precedent for certain things. So I think it's certainly a good opportunity to take stock, but they'll all be designed in, I'm sure, the best intentions. But I think this is the right moment to look what's happening next, and are these measures that are now in place necessary going forward?
Thank you, that's very helpful. Our next question will be from Angela Constance. Angela.
Sorry, I have to...
Alex, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a final question to Adam. This was about the easing of restrictions and the fact that they may be discriminatory to certain groups of people, particularly older people. And we've heard that there was a survey, I think just yesterday or the day before, which suggested the majority of younger people felt that we should keep restrictions on older people for longer, whereas older people had a very different idea. And I just wondered if Adam could give us his reflections on how we ease lockdown in a non-discriminatory way for older people.
Thank you. Adam.
Well, I think if it's going to be non-discriminatory, then it's got to be the same rules for everyone. And look, there's two parts to this. One is that it's very clear that this virus and disease is having a devastating impact on the lives of some of our oldest citizens of this country. When 75% of all deaths happen or occur of those who are over 75, it's absolutely clear this is a big problem. But it's also not true to say that the health of one individual, whatever their age, is the same as a whole age group. For instance, someone who's 71 and might run a marathon is completely different to somebody whose health who might be in their 80s, or indeed someone in their 40s. So it's making sure that the support that's available to people, for instance, what have we got? There are 171,000 plus people on the sort of the shielding list, as an example. But of that, 40% are over 70. So there's that look at, there's a balance there. The fact
Adam.
that there are still people in their 70s, still people in their 70s.
Adam, sorry to cut across you there. I'm conscious that Alison Harris wants to explore this area, so I'll maybe pause you there, and then we can talk a bit more about this when Alison comes in with her questions.
Sure.
So moving on to Angela Constance, please, Angela.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to the panel. I should declare an interest as a former mental health officer, and I would like to ask two questions. My first question is about adults with incapacity and the legislation that flows from that. First part of my question, I think, will be for Judith to answer. And I've seen, Judith, from your organisation's briefing that you have expressed some views on adults with incapacity, so I would be grateful if, for the record, that you could outline what were your concerns and what are your ongoing concerns. The second part of my question is for Adam, and it relates more to what's actually happening on the front line. Adults with incapacity is a piece of legislation that has various legal processes around it, but nonetheless has important safeguards for people when they're being moved from, say, hospital to a care home, or indeed from home to a care home, or any sort of movement of placement. So if I could turn to Judith in the first instance, please.
Thank you. Judith.
Thank you very much for the question. So our concern was focused on the provisions with respect to the Social Work Scotland Act, which, as we understand, have not yet been brought into force. We actually do think they won't be used, but were they to be brought in, they would basically allow local authorities to disapply key principles of the Adult with Incapacity Act, including the requirement to take into account the views and wishes of the person and their relative, carer or guardian in connection with the provision of community care support, including moving home, which engages the right to liberty. You will maybe have noticed that the Mental Health and Disability Committee, the Law Society of Scotland, have made submission to the committee to raise their concerns about proper procedures under the Adult with Incapacity legislation not being carried out. So people effectively may be having decisions taken without the proper legal basis. And we're concerned from an access to justice perspective that it's difficult for anybody to access the courts at the moment. So we have a range of concerns about those provisions, but at the moment we understand they have not been brought into force.
Thank you.
Angela.
Thank you. And I wonder if Adam would like to share with us his views or experiences about what's happening on the front line, on the ground.
Thank you. Adam.
Thank you for that. There's quite a complex picture, actually, in terms of what's been happening on the ground, and depending on the person's kind of health and they're in. I think what I'd like to kind of touch on in this, in terms of adults in capacity or those with diminished capacity, is where there have been sort of blanket decisions made in certain settings about somebody's health or their care, and potentially the appropriate conversations not being had. And what I mean by this is that we were sent a letter, and it was anonymised, and so I could share it with the committee in due course. But it was, for instance, it was a letter from a care home saying that nobody in the care home, would be getting medical treatment if anyone fell ill. There would be sort of end of life care only. Now, not everybody in the care home, for instance, the guardianship or power of attorney, they had their own capacity, and that was sort of a deprivation of, I think, their own liberty there if that was to happen. But there are good occasions when I don't think the proper process has been in place, where those who have power of attorney, for instance, have been consulted about something. Let's go back to whether it was a DNAR form or whether it was the moving wherever it might be. But particular concern that we have is this restriction or the potential for access to medical treatment, but there's no conversations happening with the appropriate person, the POA or their guardian, about what will happen in the care home setting or in a hospital setting. And that's again, it's a mixed picture and a complex one. But there are certainly things that our helpline have heard from people very concerned about this.
Thank you. Angela, are you content, Angela?
I am for the time being, convener. I have one more quick question with respect to social care. In particular, sections 16 and 17 of the Coronavirus Act, in essence, seen the potential downgrade of local authority duties to powers with respect to assessed need. And I would like to know the panel's views again, if they can, what impact that is having with the delivery of services. We know the purpose of that legislation was to ensure that organisations could be fleet of foot, make decisions quickly and get help to where it is needed. So is that actually happening? And maybe the panel could reflect on the importance of the role of the third sector, the voluntary sector, in delivering responsive social care.
Thank you, Angela.
Maybe I could go to Adam first for that.
Adam.
I'll sort of take the second part of your question first, if that's okay, and the role of the sort of third sector, independent sector, and delivery of social care in this. From, I want to say, end of March, there were a number of examples of social care being withdrawn from people as a result of, response to the crisis, whether people were needing to, carers, for instance, themselves, or social care staff, or companies that were delivering this care had needed to self-isolate or had symptoms themselves. And there were some quite worrying examples of practice in Glasgow, where a huge number of people who needed care, it was withdrawn overnight, and they weren't sure where this would come from. And family members might have to step in because there was someone who was nearby, but these people themselves might have been isolating or have symptoms or be over 70. So it didn't really work. And I think that there has been a massive pressure on social care throughout this crisis, but we knew this before. This is not new. I think you won't be silent. The calls that we've been making in the past for much more investment in it, but kind of a massive recruitment that's required in social care to make it more resilient. And as we've seen, as people are kind of had to isolate, that delivery of it has been really difficult. Now there are 30,000 people living in care homes as a place of residence, but there is also tens of thousands delivering, getting social care in their own home, and who lots of places have been left without what they need. So that's been quite difficult, and I think that there's been lots of organisations stepping in to deliver help in a number of ways, maybe not as robust as what they were used to, but getting in there and making sure that people are looked after to some degree. And in terms, the first part there, in terms of how the change of the powers and how local authorities and their responsibilities are, again, this is really complex. We've had some examples of people who have been moved maybe from hospital into a care home setting, but we're also aware of the provisions that they won't necessarily be charged for this until there's a point that it's their permanent residence, and these assessments and financial assessments and these assessments are sort of delayed at times. So it is quite tricky when actually there's not, I think part of this goes back to that confusion in the public at times in terms of what's happening, what's required, and what powers people have, and this translation in a very simple way so people can understand. But accessing social care and understanding what happens, whether it's different types of assessments, can be very, very tricky if it's the first time you've ever encountered them to understand what is happening.
Thank you. Judith, do you wish to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you. So there has been, just to add to that picture, there has been some guidance to local authorities with regard to the assessment process, which the Scottish Government has developed. And it refers, first of all, to the UK Government Ethical Framework on Social Care, which we have looked at and regard as not being sufficiently robust in places, and does not set out with sufficient clarity the legal duties which continue to apply to the actions or omissions of public authorities, in particular under the Human Rights Act 1998. Additionally, there's limited reference to human rights within the ethical framework and no reference to the guiding principles on the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to which the UK has been a state party since 2009. This is particularly disappointing in the Scottish context because Scotland has endeavoured to become familiar with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to put that into action more practically than probably has happened in the rest of the UK. And the CRPD, as it is known, would have provided a rights-based framework for the development of guidance and policy. So we both share your concern about these aspects of the legislation. We also, in dint of our own monitoring that we've been doing on the delivery and implementation of the legislation, I can outline a number of specific concerns in that people may end up, just to support what Adam was saying there, may end up with an inappropriate or inadequate care plan. In the case of adults with incapacity, it may have further repercussions with respect to procedural safeguards. Carers may be called on to do more, and that's been completely backed up by evidence from other third sector organisations, but within a framework where people's needs have not been fully assessed, and people are not being supported adequately to participate in the process around the decisions that are being made on their behalf, which is a key principle of the CRPD, and one which is really undermining people in this kind of climate. Again, we would reiterate that a concern that the recording of both the decisions being made and the way decisions are being made is if it's happening, is very patchy. And the requirement on authorities to report in relation to these processes also needs to be fully resourced and made sure that actually there's a clear picture around the country of what is happening with people. Organisations like Adams, like Inclusion Scotland, are doing an amazing job to gather that information in as robust manner that they can, but actually the duty is on the local authority to do that.
Thank you, Judith. That's helpful. I'm going to move on to our next questions now from Maurice Golden. Maurice, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask Adam a couple of follow-up questions based on his earlier answers. So first of all, Adam, in terms of the messaging and communications, you mentioned that there was increase in phone calls to your hotline. The top line message was clearly because that's then for the majority of the population, but for those individuals that were calling, what else could be done to improve the specific communications to those individuals?
Adam.
Well, thanks for that. I think what was interesting, so the Age Scotland helpline would typically take around about 70 calls a day from older people, but there have been times during this last 2 months where the calls have peaked 840 on that day, one day, in terms of that kind of demand. So we've had to scale up massively and refocus the whole organisation on this. Thankfully, they've kind of settled down a lot, but still sort of 4 times more than they would normally be taking. And the critical point in this is that how people consume their information and the audience. Now, we've become all too accustomed to be able to jump on a website and find out, further details and what everything means. But there are 500,000 over 60s in Scotland who do not use the internet. And their main source of information will be the news. And the daily news briefings the First Minister has been undertaking with whether it's Cabinet Secretary for Health or Chief Medical Officer or the National Clinical Director have been really helpful in terms of setting out that top line message. But when there is something underneath that's immediately on NHS Inform or the Scottish Government website, but often it's not for till the next day, the phone calls come in to say, what does this mean? What can I do? So colleagues of mine on our team, one of the things that we have been doing is watching every briefing, writing everything we possibly can down and almost building a matrix from there about the types of questions that come in, which are, can I do this? Can I do that? Can I go for a walk? Can I go to visit my husband's grave? And having to refer back to the guidance about how do these things apply to you, not saying yes or no, but almost like people are calling us asking for permission or something. And so the top line stuff has been great, but again, this where does the rest of the information go? And people might be able to read it in the newspapers the next day, but they've also not been able to leave their home to go and buy a newspaper. or from all, from lots of things therein. So the kind of consumption of the media can't be digital only. But that said, we've had to create digital assets that our helpline call handlers can use, whether it's on our website, the public can use to better inform those people who could pass it on, family members as well, to find out what everything means. So it is, sticking it on a website is fine for some people, but think about the population of Edinburgh over 60 don't use the internet. And these are the people that were primarily those who've been asked to shield or at extreme risk of, or a really high risk of extreme illness. Those are most concerned, wondering, what do I do? Just tell us. And how hard it's been to respond. But I think colleagues in our helpline have done so really incredibly well. And I think it's been just a really important part of our inclusive communication, and spending time going into some extra detail that people consume. TV and radio are hugely important as a means of informing the public.
Thank you, Adam. Maurice.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. That's very interesting. Just another topic I'd like to explore with you, Adam, was around the do not attempt to resuscitate forms. And you said that I think I can quote you saying that they were spreading fear and panic.
Yeah.
But also that this wasn't a Scottish Government initiative. Therefore, were you seeing that? Do you have a sense of whether it was health boards or some, guidance that everyone suddenly referred to, or did we see this across the whole of Scotland? Can you add a bit more information around that?
Adam.
Yeah, sure. So it's been quite confusing to try and establish why these happened in the first place. And one of the things I was really concerned about are who are the people on these lists getting phone calls? Like, what is the criteria? Is it an age? Is it an age plus certain conditions? To work out, I know people who would be 75 plus that didn't get a phone call asking them to sign a do not attempt resuscitation form. But then again, we've had colleagues and friends whose family members have. And there sort of slowly but surely letters were circulating online that people were receiving from doctors. And there was a very early example actually from Wales. And almost as a result of that, there were letters coming out from GP practices or phone calls from practices in Scotland. And there was, I don't want to take too much stock in it, but a tweet I saw from some doctor saying that the ministers had asked them to do this. So kind of thought about, has this happened? But asked officials in the Scottish Government about this, and they said we didn't. We had to respond to things we saw publicly and communicate with practices through the practice network to ask them, you do not need to do this. Now, they've found the number of complaints they've had about this, Scottish Government or the Health Department, decreased significantly in the last month, but we are still seeing examples of it. We're still getting calls to our helpline where people are getting these conversations, but also on top of that, their family members are leaving hospital, and there's a DNAR form slipped into their discharge notes. Now, these people don't have their own capacity that have been leaving hospital. They might have dementia, and the power of attorney isn't consulted. There have been administrative staff who've been calling up older people who, again, have dementia and have agreed to something on the phone. But the whole point about the DNAR forms is, look, it's a clinical decision, but there must be a conversation between the clinical person and the patient about it. Ultimately, it's about whether someone's a chance of survival at the medical procedure, but the communication behind it. People didn't know what the devil in a DNAR form was, and they thought what this meant was, we're not going to get medical treatment. We're being left to die if we get this. But that's also coupled with examples where you're hearing, and again, they are anecdotal, so I can't point them. I don't want to cast too many versions, but of maybe GPs and medical folks saying, we're not going to be delivering kind of medical treatment if you get coronavirus. We'll deliver end-of-life care or just kind of make you as comfortable as possible. So all these things together are people going, right, I'm now 75, I'm being written off. I'm being written off, I'm not going to get any treatment. And we've also an example of a younger woman who her only condition that she has was hearing loss. She got a phone call to say, would you sign a DNAR form? There is no logic in this at all. And I think the Scottish Government have been quite good, and the officials behind it, in terms of trying to stamp it out when they see it. And I know the First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Health have made this clear in their daily briefings, but it's still happening. And we had a call just 2 days ago, and I'm sort of meaning to call back the person who called in to find more details of this, but it's just not on. at all. Fear, anxiety that a virus is spreading to the country, they'll be left behind as everyone else is looked after. I don't think that is put us in a good light at all.
Thank you, Adam. I think it's a very important topic that the committee probably will want to have a further look at. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to our next questioner, who is Alison Harris. Alison.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. If I could address my question to Adam firstly, I know that you started to explore this earlier, Adam, and I heard you say that rules must apply to everyone of all ages. I absolutely agree with that. That you have some 70-year-olds that are fitter than 40-year-olds. I actually know 80-year-olds that are more active than some 50-year-olds. However, older people are in the group deemed at risk. And my concern, well, my question to you really is, as a society, we do need to look how we ease lockdown and get back to whatever some kind of normal. So, Adam, do you have any thoughts on what would be the best way and the right way to go about this? Easing the restrictions whilst bearing in mind the health concerns for these groups that maybe are more at risk.
There's a lot in this. I could spend hours talking to you about this, but I'll be very brief if I can. The impact of the older people's mental health, physical health and loneliness throughout this crisis has been extraordinary, but it has also been that of people of all ages, and it's been very, very difficult. One of the things which has been really important throughout this is the support, the shielding support that has been available for people, whether it's access to food, which is still not as good as it could be, access to medication, access to mental health support, GPs, transport, bereavement support. All of these things have been put in place and have been building. One of the things which will be hugely important, and this is on that caveat that not all older people are going to be ill, not all older people are in the same situation, but people will be given that opportunity that if they are worried, if they're concerned and anxious about what the future holds, and they feel that they need to stay in their own homes or to adopt quite extreme physical and social distancing measures, that they are supported with everything they need to live well. And we've been building up to this point, and my concern and our concern is that once we get to this new normal, whatever that might be, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and it's not going to be anything like we've had before, is this support that has existed, which isn't perfect yet, has taken 2 months to get to a point when it's pretty good. Will that diminish? And for those people who need it the most, I think it's something like there must be 80,000 people maybe who are accessing Shield now, and more that kind of need help. So those people who are 72 that still work, they need to go back to work somehow. They can't work from home, and they're being left behind in this working from home pattern. People are still economically active. People are still have caring responsibilities, whether it's for grandchildren or for family members too. But people need given the best support to make the right decision, and that people aren't just, again, I was regularly challenged by someone I know who's 78 to run a marathon with them. I will not be able to run a marathon, and I'm clear about that, but he will, and good on him. I'm 35. So there's kind of the health difference, but people are active. People are really getting more and more lonely. We knew before this, I don't go too much, that 100,000 older people in Scotland would be lonely all or most of the time. One person on every street in Scotland. 106,000 spent Christmas Day alone. That gives you the measure of that kind of extreme loneliness. It's got worse for people, but for more people experiencing what this will do, we can't just lock people up on a broad assumption of their age, but make sure every measure of support that is building to this point is there for them whenever they need it, and it's not taken away from anybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Alison.
Yes. No, I accept what he's saying. I'm not sure if maybe the other thing you'd like to add anything to? Judith, sorry.
Yes, that's fine. And a couple of things really. I completely agree with everything Adam has said, and I think one of the things that the Commission has been recommending in relation, well, there's two aspects to this. One is the necessity of taking a rights-based approach to this, and the development of a process whereby people, both as individuals and as groups, both have a say in how these processes can unfold, that they are enabled to participate in decision making around how these processes unfold, that people are making informed choices about what actions they can take. And it's fascinating at a level to hear about the kind of questions that Age Scotland are receiving in relation to the guidance and the level of sort of detail people are really looking for in terms of being able to respond or feel comfortable that what their response is appropriate. So that whole rights-based approach to this process is really important. But the other thing I would reiterate, again, in support of what Adam was saying there, is that we're building on a situation which is already not very good, and I don't mean as a result of Corona. I mean as a result of 10 years of austerity. We're building on a situation where economic, social and cultural rights have been eroded systematically over a period of time, and where people's ability to engage in these processes in Scotland is potentially in some settings better than it is in the rest of the UK, but in other areas not at all. And so that comprehensive sort of understanding of people's rights in relation to both their economic participation, their all other social rights in relation to health, education, adequate standard of living, housing, etc. These are all still live, pertinent issues that haven't gone away as a result of the virus, and as Adam was saying, have been exacerbated in many contexts. And the support packages that have been put in place in recognition of some of these aspects for people of all ages have been really important and have helped. There's also been big gaps, so that's not been a comprehensive analysis, and that full holistic approach to looking at people's rights in the round has really not been undertaken in a reasonable way. Now, recognising we're in a public health crisis, but we now have an opportunity and the time and the space to look at this from a different perspective. And one of the things the Commission is really keen to see is that there is a Scottish Government focus on increasing the protections around people's economic and social cultural rights through, for example, the First Minister's Advisory Group and Task Force on Human Rights Leadership. That's a really important process. That needs to be sustained, it needs to be strengthened, it needs to be recognised that that's part of the response to this situation as well as the wider issues.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Judith, that's Alison, I'm going to move on to Fulton now, if that's okay. Fulton,
that's fine. Thank
you. Thanks, convener. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Thanks, convener. Yeah, I was going to ask a wee bit about the ethical advice around particularly end-of-life decision making, but I think that most of that already in Maurice Golden's question. So I suppose I would have two questions, and in the interest of time I'll ask them together. In relation to the ethical advice around end-of-life decision making and do not resuscitate, what revision, if any, do the panel members think needs to be made by the Scottish Government guidance to make it human rights compliant? And that's if any is required. And a follow-up question to that would be around the recently announced care home review. What would be your hopes of what might come out that review, given what we've heard about care homes and human rights in this crisis, the world over, I should say? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've covered obviously the issues around do not resuscitate are vast, and it's quite distressing. It maybe feels like we've covered what we can in our short answer session. So I wonder if I can bring in Adam to pick up on Fulton's second point there first around the care homes, please.
It's abundantly clear that care homes have been under immense pressure in this, and whether it has been about people leaving hospital, going into care homes and not clear if they've been tested, or that their measure of being able to access the appropriate levels of PPE, for instance, have been incredibly difficult. I mean, what we've got to remember in all this, and I think I've been quite uncomfortable with some of the public narrative, about looking at, is this whose fault is this? Is it the NHS? Is it care homes? Is it the government? Not the time for pointing fingers. And I don't necessarily think it's one person's fault. I think we look at care homes getting PPE, for instance, in terms of how they've been able to operate. And this just kind of goes to your point, I think, about kind of care home reviews and how they might operate in the future. Their access to market for PPE and the things that they needed in an unprecedented volume was shut off. They couldn't buy these things. There was interesting reports on the BBC disclosure about Erskine, a massive kind of organisation, but were having to buy masks on eBay. So the access to the things that they needed to protect staff, residents, and everybody weren't there, and we've all seen the problems there. So we're kind of concerned about this kind of focus on them too much. But that said, it's quite clear that this is where last week over half of all deaths are still happening in care homes, but it's been coming down, thankfully. But the measures, I think, nationally that have been taken to help care homes address this have come in quite late, despite all the kind of calls and protestations from people about we need PPE, we need testing, we need and the care homes are quick in closing down access to their homes for friends and family and visits before most other countries, actually. And infection control, I think, for them is bread and butter, but it's quite hard to control against something you can't see and don't know about. So I think going forward is making sure that care homes and people in them have this kind of easy access to all the things that they might need, because it's part of our health and well-being in terms of social care. It's not the same as the NHS, but it's very much they are together. We've got health and social care partnerships who are meant to operate in a way that's kind of that one approach. They aren't working perfectly yet at all. I think this crisis has highlighted that. But in terms of care and review, we just got to make sure that it's supported, actually. Wherever somebody's getting their social care, it's something that, touch wood, we're all going to get older, but a lot of us might need some extra help to be able to live. It's not just about kind of surviving and existing, it's about living. And the care home and social care has just been shown as maybe being a second-tier service, or seen that way, and has maybe been treated at times that way in the rush to protect the NHS, rightly so, but we had the capacity to also protect social care when we needed it. So bringing in PPE, you saw a reduction in deaths and infections, and looking at testing will certainly help people understand what is going on. So more information is better than less. So I think that's probably all I can really say in the time. That's okay.
Thank you, Adam. Judith, I wonder if I could, I noticed you didn't get an opportunity to respond on the questions from Maurice Golden around sort of end-of-life ethical decisions and the do not resuscitate. I wonder if I can hear you to make your remarks in response to the first part of Fulton's question there around that. Judith?
Yeah, it was really just to say, and it's also in response to Fulton's question about the clinical guidance. We actually submitted, in relation to the clinical guidance from a human rights perspective, there's a very good briefing which I can share with the committee to really detail out what our concerns were. They were we did have concerns. There were significant human rights concerns that we describe, and the main one being no blanket policies on anticipatory care planning and DNRs, but also a real recognition that the use of the clinical frailty scale, for example, is not appropriate for key groups. It's recognised by the scale itself and the use of the scale that it isn't appropriate for key groups, but I really suppose I would say terrible example of where language that is actually used within a clinical setting or amongst clinicians has got a certain degree of understanding amongst those people and no understanding amongst the rest of the population, but being used and referred to and for purposes that were completely not appropriate. And so that there's specific aspects within the guidance we make reference to, but we've also been working very constructively with the CMO office. And my understanding is that revised guidance is coming out at the end of this week, and that process of revising that guidance has been a very participatory one. It's had a lot of engagement from different third sector organisations and other stakeholders within relevant sectors, and so I would expect to see that guidance revised and renewed. I would also say, however, it also needs to be translated into a form of English that people can really understand. And if it is going to be used in settings where people's rights are going to be at stake at a level, then it needs to be made available to people in a format in a way that everybody can engage with it, not just clinicians, but carers, staff in all sorts of different settings. So that inclusive communication is a really crucial part of these processes. And if there's one thing we should have learned in this process, is that we can't make assumptions about how people use information, and the way information is described needs to be so clear, and from our perspective, articulate explicitly what people's rights are. Because that was one of our notes in terms of the failure of the guidance in the first instance. So I would look forward to seeing revised guidance coming out this week. We've had a lot of involvement in that, but I will share the briefing that we've done.
Thank you, that's helpful, Judith. Fulton, I'm conscious that we're into our last 5 minutes, so I'm going to bring Pauline McNeil now for her questions. Pauline.
Thank you very much, Convener. Well, my question firstly is to Judith around human rights. So it's going to be a central feature, I think, of the COVID inquiry. One example I wanted to give you of the early days, certainly, of where I think human rights may have been violated, and I wondered if you could comment, and that is the right to visit or have some conversation with clinicians around your dying loved one. Now, I have cases of this where in the early days, where a constituent of mine had one phone call, no proper conversation, and my concern is about who advocate. In normal times, you advocate on behalf of your loved one and you argue with doctors, which I'm sure we've all done. And I wondered if, Judith, you thought that when we look at all of this, this cannot be I would suggest cannot be allowed to happen again. It is a violation of your rights to protect your loved one, even in these difficult circumstances. And the second one's just to Adam. I mean, it's been well covered about this issue of age discrimination. It's quite clear that clinicians were making decisions for over 65s not to be admitted to hospital. But I wondered, Adam, if you thought that that was based on the lack of availability of proper facilities. So if the government said they didn't know about it, I mean, when we look at it, perhaps we need to factor into this outrageous decision, I would say, if that's the case, that the government also need to account for these decisions and whether or not it was based on the availability of ventilators.
We'll go to Judith first, please. Judith.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's a lot in what you're saying, Pauline, and I think in relation to, I'll deal with the first question specifically around the rights you're describing, which really talk, I think, to two sets of rights: the right to private and family life, and then the right to participate in decision making around that what are being around decisions that are being made. So I would say the rights are engaged. These are relevant. This is a relevant conversation to be having from a rights-based perspective, and in normal circumstances, it would be absolutely the duty of clinicians to engage different stakeholders in the decisions, particularly the person most affected, and where capacity was implicated, then the next person, the carer, the key carer, or whoever was designated decision maker. And so I would say, however, you're also balancing up another set of circumstances around people's right to life, and the need in an emergency to enable clinicians to make decisions. And I think, again, the lessons that we will learn from this process and the scrutiny, I would say the level of awareness and scrutiny that has been brought to aspects of these processes, like just the set of circumstances you're describing, which have been so painful and difficult for people to deal with, is a really important. It's a really important part of the process. And where we might have reacted with a blanket decision, again, human rights guidance would say don't do that. Don't take a blanket decision in the first instance. Take decisions and then review them and then review them. And my understanding is that has been reviewed and the decisions have changed and processes have evolved as clinicians principally have become more comfortable with what they're actually dealing with and less concerned that other people's lives are going to be put at risk by enabling family visits, etc. So I think unpacking all that, all of those decisions, is all that learning, and again, to do that from a human rights perspective could be really guide the outcomes and the learning that we have down the line. These are really good questions that the committee is asking, and these are the questions that need to be asked of all the decision makers in the sectors, and then down to individual GPs who may or may not be sending DNR notices or whatever. And so achieving that degree of understanding right through the system is a really important part of the process, and I think that's something that we need to strive towards as we come out the other side of this, hopefully.
Thank you, Judith. Panel and members, unfortunately we're a bit constrained for time in this format, so I wonder, Adam, if you would mind dropping a note to the committee in answer to Pauline's second question there. I thank witnesses very much for taking part this morning. And I've asked that you can wait for broadcasting to switch off your video and microphone. You'll then be free to leave the meeting, and you can of course continue to watch us on Scottish Parliament TV. We'll now briefly suspend while broadcasting set up panel 2. Welcome back, and good morning to panel 2. And if I can just repeat my thanks to witnesses for being with us here this morning. I'll also repeat how this session will continue, just for the benefit of our new witnesses. Unusually, we're going to take questions in a pre-arranged order. I'll invite members to ask questions, then I'll invite witnesses to respond also in a pre-arranged order. If you wait for me to say your name before speaking, that's really helpful. And if I can ask everyone to keep questions and answers succinct. If you give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your questions or provide an answer. So welcome to the witnesses on our second panel. Girijambo Polabutu, Manager, Shakti Women's Aid. Emma Rich, Executive Director in Gender. And Dr. Marcia Scott, Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. And if I may ask the first question, and I'd like to direct it to Emma Rich, please. Your initial, or Engender's initial briefing, which was very helpful on women and COVID-19, made several recommendations, some of which have been met by both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. Can I ask Emma what outstanding recommendations would Engender to consider to be most urgent, please? Emma.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think we are most concerned at the moment about the extent to which gender mainstreaming is happening in response to COVID-19. And I think your first question to the first panel about the extent to which equality and human rights impact assessment is happening really goes to the heart of our concerns. In our initial briefing, written by my colleague Ailey Dixon, we talked a lot about the experiences that previous pandemics could tell us in terms of the need to focus on women and men specific issues and to avoid making some of the mistakes made in the SARS, Ebola and Zika pandemics that saw a reallocation of focus and priority away from women's equality and rights, that would in Scotland cause a similar rollback. And I think our particular concern is that although there has been some very welcome leadership in terms of a statement and calls from the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, and also a call from the Permanent Secretary for Scottish Government officials to consider equality and human rights issues, we're really not seeing that in practice play out as we would hope. So, for example, we are very, very concerned at the extent to which the closure of social care services and also childcare and education settings has essentially displaced a whole bunch of care and domestic work onto women in the household. And there was information out from the Institute of Fiscal Studies yesterday showing this is disproportionately being done by women. We're concerned that when lockdown eases and education settings reopen, that women will simply not be able to return to the juggling act they did pre-COVID because transport provision of services just won't support them to do that. And we don't find that appearing in the initial impact assessments that have been published. So we think there's a real indication that some of these critical issues around which there is quite a lot of data are just not being integrated into government decision making.
So you would say that if Scottish Government are carrying out these equality impact assessments, if these issues aren't being flagged, it would indicate that there's perhaps a problem with the way they're being done, or that
it's quite difficult to tell what the precise nature of the difficulty is, because they're not very rich and full of information. So we don't think equality impact assessment is being done properly. We don't think adequate data is being used, and we don't think it's being analysed appropriately. But because the publications themselves are so scanty, it's not quite straightforward to see what's happening. And so we think where government is succeeding is because of specific advocacy delivered by organisations outside government. So the response to violence against women, for example, has been exemplary, and we think part of that is advocacy from sister organisations in Rape Crisis Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid, less because officials have arrived there because of impact assessment.
Okay. Hear what you're saying. Thank you very much. We'll move on to Deputy Convener now, Alex Cole-Hamilton, please. Alex.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. My question is about access to services. Obviously, we all know the terrible reality of an increase in domestic violence as a result of lockdown, a result of people living on top of each other in close proximity. But the corollary to that is that people don't necessarily have the ready access that they might have done in being able to walk into an organisation like Shakti or any other that provides help for women experiencing this violence. Can I ask, first of all, what provision has there been made in the community? There was talk at the start of having pharmacists offering a service to signpost people, women who'd experienced violence, to help. And also, can I ask about provision in refuges and how refuges have adapted to the restrictions of lockdown?
Okay, thank you. Can I come to Giri first for that, please?
Hi. We stopped our face-to-face contact since 23rd of March when the lockdown was announced. But at the same time, we had used the technology to get in touch with women. Again, it has its own challenges, which I may have chance to mention it later. But with the refuge itself, we only have 4 refuge spaces in Edinburgh, although we support women in other temporary accommodation in Edinburgh. For example, last year in 19 and 20, we had 10 women in our refuge. I need to give you this background. 10 women in the refuge. One of the reasons for such low numbers is because of the unavailability of permanent accommodation in Edinburgh. It's taking any time between 18 months to 2 years for a woman to move into a permanent accommodation. But at the same time, we supported 125 women in other temporary accommodation, which means it could be City of Edinburgh Council temporary accommodation, and most women were in B&B to start off. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So in the refuge itself, so we did have the contact, but then the contact is keeping the social distance. For example, we delivered food to the women in the refuge, but it will be at the door. And we have been using PPE equipment. So that's what we have been doing with the refuge. But at the same time, we also had difficulties moving women who were offered permanent accommodation during the lockdown. And the difficulties were on both sides, from the permanent accommodation side and also for us to move in. Saying that, we did manage to move one woman using taxis. It's all through phone and FaceTiming and all. It is difficult. I'm not saying it's very challenging. And then I'll come to the challenges later. Yeah, that's what we have just now.
Thank you for those initial reflections. Can I bring in Marcia Scott to respond to Alex's question, please? Marcia.
Yeah, absolutely. We are very concerned seeing big increases over the last week's calls to our helpline. around women feeling, it's really clear that it's not that the epidemic is causing increased domestic abuse, but the lack of available access to services, and also the concerns about whether women can actually move freely, take their children and flee, those kinds of questions. The impact on refuge has been very significant and very concerning. The accommodations for the pandemic in our refuges have meant that we've had to really shrink the capacity. So, for instance, all of our refuges that have communal shared space, many of them have been moved from multiple family to a single family accommodation, which really reduces the total amount of families that we can rehouse. This has all been compounded really significantly by the fact that almost all of our local authorities have essentially frozen allocations processes, which means that all of our refuges, from what we can gather from our services, are now full. But the demand has not stopped, needless to say, and we expect as lockdown eases that we'll see a surge in demand. And so there's really been a lockjam, and the system itself has created more harm than it has removed.
Okay. Thank you. Alex, are you content for me to move on? I think we'll have opportunity to explore this more as we move on. Nodding, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I bring in Angela Constance, please? Angela.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I don't want to cut across questions that I know Alison Harris wants to ask about refugees, no recourse to public funds. So therefore, could I just ask the panel, perhaps starting with Marcia, whether they think that more needs to be done to raise awareness and knowledge of the impact of no recourse to public funds following the Prime Minister's press conference yesterday?
Marcia.
Well, I'm sorry, I should have waited. I didn't see the Prime Minister's press conference, I'm afraid. But I will say that we we've been asking for some data about the new ability now for women with no recourse to public funds to be housed by local authorities under the public health emergency rules. And we've asked for monitoring data to know how that's going. We've heard some stories early in the process that said it was going really well in some local authorities, and other local authorities were requiring women to be showing symptoms of infection before they would house them. There's a variety of sort of soft data, but we really think that it's the government's responsibility to be being proactive about gathering data from local authorities about how the new ability, which has always been a problem in Scotland, that we don't have power to house women with insecure immigration status.
Angela.
Convener, I would just be keen to hear from Giranjama, given her role as Shackleton Women's Aid, and of course Emma Rich. And then that's me finished.
Thank you. Giranjama.
Hi. As you all might already know, that Shakti has been involved in the No Recourse to Public Funds campaign, along with Southall Black Sisters and IMCAN in England for the past 20 years. As a result of that, we had the DDVC concession. And now, first of all, I would like to thank COSLA for their guidelines on local authorities' obligation to support women and children who have no recourse to public funds with their emergency accommodation and financial support. And we hope this will continue post-COVID period. That's our hope. But like Marsha said, initially we did have problems in spite of having the guidelines. Our workers had problems accessing accommodation for women with no recourse to public funds. For some reason, council seemed to not be aware of these guidelines. But later on, now it's better. It's better. So we are able to get the accommodation. However, saying that we have several women who were referred to us during the COVID period who rather choose to go into a BME specialist refuge rather than going into any BNB or any other temporary accommodation. And there are reasons, because some of these women are very vulnerable and have language barriers, and also now due to lockdown, there's restrictions on travel, restriction on face-to-face contacts, all this, it made it worse than normal times. So therefore, in relation to no recourse to public funds, I hope Scottish Government will continue to provide support for women with no recourse to public funds, and we will continue the campaign for no recourse to public funds women anyway, because we know, I know this short period it's been easy for us to get accommodation for women with no recourse to public funds, but prior to that it wasn't, and we are not sure what will happen after this period. We might go back to the same issues. Also, we have a project for LGBT BME women, which we realized the LGBT BME women have more challenges than the BME women who are not LGBT, and also with the accommodation and so many other things.
Okay, thank you. Emma, do you have anything additional to add, or are you content for me to move on?
Just, I suppose, to say that I would hope that the questions put to the Prime Minister and his responses would focus some additional attention on this really iniquitous and discriminatory and human rights breaching piece of policy, and that I think this highlights the importance of taking an equality and human rights based approach to developing policy. The Prime Minister seemed to say that he didn't understand the impact and seemed in the moment to perceive the injustice of it. I think it can be the case that policy is unwittingly developed that has a negative impact on particular groups of people, and I think that it just underlines the importance of impact assessment processes in policy development.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll now move on to questions from Maurice Golden. Maurice, please.
Thanks, convener. I'm quite interested to hear from the panel of what else the Scottish Government could be doing at this moment in time and what their priorities are. I'm happy if you want to return to my question as part of closing remarks, if it fits better there, but it's entirely up to you, convener.
Okay. I think we'll just go to the panel for that. It is a good question. I mean, obviously we are going to have other questioners, so it's maybe just a sort of top level response from panel members at the moment. Can I go to Emma first, please? Emma.
Thanks, convener. I suppose, first of all, our call would always be for the differences between women and men to be considered when Scottish Government is doing anything in response to COVID. I think this has been an experience in time that has shaken up a lot of the ways our public services are delivered, and also brought some issues to the fore that women's organisations have been talking about for some time. So I think some of the urgent imperatives are for us to think about how care is provided in our society. We rely enormously on the unpaid care of women, and social care provision that's unpaid by women amounts to about £10.3 billion worth per year in Scotland, and 85% of those providing social care in settings are women, and that work, in our view, has been systematically undervalued and underprotected over time, and we see the differences in access to personal protective equipment that previous panellists described. I think as Scotland transitions out of lockdown, it will be very important to pay attention to all of those details, but we'll also be thinking about how we can make the economy work for women. And in Gender and Close the Gap, we'll be launching some work this week targeted at the Economic Advisory Committee working on the post-COVID economy. But it won't surprise you, I think, to know that some of the things we'll be calling for are a revaluation of care work, a rebalancing of domestic work inside the households, considering including women in the process of inclusive growth, as well as just beneficiaries of the outcomes of inclusive growth, and ensuring that our economy is governed by and for women using the best quality, gender sensitive, sex disaggregated data. So there's big projects, I think, for Scottish Government to get its teeth into as we emerge from COVID.
Thank you, that's helpful. If I could go to other panel members, Maurice asking what more the Scottish Government should be doing at the moment. Giri, can I come to you, please?
The Scottish Government could be, one of the things what we realized is there's been an increase in referrals, and there's been an increase in referrals from agencies for some reason. There's really what is lacking is we only have outreach services in some areas of Scotland and not in all areas. So there's lack of outreach service in other areas of Scotland, other than there's one in Dundee, Stirling, Fife and Edinburgh. But then we get referrals from Glasgow, Aberdeen and other places as well. I think what the Scottish Government should be doing is to give additional funding to have outreach services in other areas, especially for Aberdeen and up north, because it's very difficult. The referrals that we get recently, it's very difficult for women to move out of that area, especially taking lockdown into consideration, and it's creating stress both for the women and for the staff who are trying to do their best to support the women who are away from where our services. So I think funding.
Okay, thank you. Marcia, can I come to you, please? Marcia.
Yeah, a number of sort of high-level things. Happy always to get into the detail if there were time, but I'm really concerned about when I look across justice and education and children and families and housing and homelessness, the cumulative impact of increased risk and harm to women and children is just so striking. And I'm really concerned that there isn't anybody in the Scottish Government that's actually stepping back and looking across the whole piece and realizing what what are really well-intentioned and very difficult decisions that are being made in each of those areas, that the consequence of them cumulatively is an enormous contribution to the harm being experienced by women and children, and especially women and children experiencing domestic abuse. I would love for there to be some much more rigorous and commitment to both the impact assessment process, but engagement with those of us who are seeing it across the picture. I'm also really, really worried about the impact of what I think we all think is a coming recession on funding for services. We know that the last time there was a major economic challenge when the financial crisis happened in 2008, as a consequence of that and austerity policies and cuts to local services, that we saw the stability of our entire network really destroyed, really. And in some places we lost some services, some had to combine. It's really been, and they've been fragile ever since. I'm desperately worried that as we go into do our economic planning for recovery, that unless it is very clearly stated that we need to change the way we fund frontline services in order to protect them from these kinds of dynamics, then we will see major parts of our network close. And we do know, and I'll be quick, but we have a commitment already in the Equally Safe delivery plan to look at restructuring that. And I would really like us to pick that up with some speed so that it could be included in the economic planning. And finally, just the last thing, which is lots of redesign happening in lots of, obviously the court processes are very clearly in the public's eye about whether we should adopt or test a model of juryless trials. I'm very concerned about the summary court processes and a failure to involve the victims' organizations, and specifically Scottish Women's Aid and Victim Support, in the redesign of summary courts, which are the vast majority of domestic abuse cases. So we can be helpful, and
Yes.
we'd rather be part of it rather than having to be critical afterwards.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to Alison Harris, please, for her questions. Alison.
Thank you, Convener. I think a lot of the questions I wanted to ask have really been covered in the topic. So just very briefly, I think it has been mentioned that sadly and very tragically there has been a huge rise in the number of the domestic violence cases, caused more by being constrained with lockdown. I just want to ask the panel, what more could the Scottish Government reasonably and practically do going forward? I know they've tried to meet needs, but what more could they actually do being reasonable and practical?
I wonder, we've covered some of that there in the last...
A lot. We've covered women's refuge. Yes, we've covered a lot of my questions, actually, Convener.
I know. It's the difficulty of doing in this format. We can't throw things
talk about this all day, but yes. So I'm happy to feel it's covered to move on.
Well, I wonder that if there might be some specific information that would be helpful around for the committee around what's happening differently. I know locally I've had information that actually it's not so much an increase in cases, but it's the severity of what women are experiencing because of the lockdown. Could you tell us what's happening differently for women because of the restrictions that are in place? If I go to Giri first, please.
What's happening differently? When we all speak about there's increase in domestic abuse incidents and all, like Marsha said, it's not the domestic abuse that has changed, it's just the COVID and the behavior and women being locked in with the perpetrator 24/7 is what changed. But what I want to say, it is different for BME women in the sense that many of our women are not just living with the perpetrator; they're living with multiple perpetrators in closed doors, which is when I say multiple perpetrators, if they're living in a joint family, they have the mother-in-law who is a perpetrator. They may have a sister-in-law who is a perpetrator. They may have a brother-in-law who is a perpetrator. On top of that, the husband himself. So especially with the outreach service where the women are living with perpetrators, it's become extremely difficult to be in touch with the woman or the woman to be in touch with her caseworker, which is creating so much problem. Because previously, before lockdown, if the perpetrators are away, she had a chance, either when she's out and about, to call her caseworker. That has changed, and it's putting women at high risk. And another thing with our women, I don't know whether I have time, but with the technology, the language barrier, and then most of them previously would take help of the children to text the caseworker or help of a friend to text the caseworker when they want an appointment or when they want to speak to a caseworker, and then she would call. And also use of technology, either they don't have the technology like computers or smartphones or anything, or even if they have, it's the language barrier. So that's made more difficult for us, and not finding a safe time or a place to call their support workers, and with the helplines as well. When women are calling the helpline, not finding on the other end, if the person can't speak the language, and the woman only may have one chance, and when she calls, the other person can't speak her language, and she might not have another chance to make that call. And also some women lose the strength, the braveness to call. Make it another call. So that's happening.
Sure.
Sorry.
Sorry to cut across you. Just what could be changed, or what could happen if something could be changed or something put in place now that would make BME women who are at risk of violence in the home safer? What would you do? What would you change?
like I said, we need more staff. Like what has been acknowledged is just now by the government is services for the service user, but we are not thinking about, okay, there's demand in work. That means we also need more workforce. What would help us, like I said previously, what would help us is to have some more funding for outreach services. You know, especially we have in Dundee, but we are looking for somebody in Aberdeen, like, who is up, if they have to get in touch with the woman, or even keeping the social distance, and they need to meet the women, there is that possibility. For somebody to go travel from Dundee to Aberdeen, that's
Okay.
not happening. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. Marcia, can I come to you, please, Marcia?
Everything that Gary said, plus a few other things to maybe highlight. One would be that and young people are really at risk of being considered sort of collateral damage when people talk about domestic abuse. But the reality is they're victims just as much as their mothers. And not only are they not safe at home when they're living with an abuser, but all the places where they're usually safest, so school, nursery, after-school clubs, have been whisked away from them. And we are really, really struggling to get them in places, to get them in school places. And there's some complexities. It's particularly difficult in very remote and rural areas, reasons I'm happy to share. But the failure to actually recognize children living with domestic abuse as a very, very large proportion of the vulnerable children in Scotland, and to work with us to try and do something about safe spaces is really difficult. The other thing that we're seeing is really different is that arrangements around custody and visitation have really been made more difficult because of lockdown. So we had a number of cases where children were supposed to be returned to their mothers, and the offending parent, who was the father in these cases, had said that it was too dangerous to return the child because of infection, or the child had been exposed. I mean, we had one woman who went 3 weeks without her child, and we couldn't get the system to respond to that as a child protection issue. So I think there are things that are very different. They are very different by the pandemic, but the reason they're so bad is because the system hasn't responded very well.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Can I move on to questions from Fulton McGregor now, please? Fulton.
Hey, thanks, convener. My line of questioning is very much in the same theme. Early on in the lockdown, I was asked about visitations to a local park on a nice day, and clearly the main response was that people should not have been doing that, and we're putting the population at risk. But one of the things that did dawn on me, which I'm sure would have dawned on every committee member here, is we don't know the situations of those individuals, and we don't know the situations of some of the women who were there with their children, because it's just not possible to know. And we do know that many women, as we've talked about, are experiencing domestic violence, and it is a lot worse during lockdown. So I wonder, my question is, we've sort of talked around the themes, but my question is, how can we, what could be done for more specific guidance, not so much in terms of the support, so I think that that's been covered and we do need more support, but what can be done in terms of the guidance for people who are experiencing domestic violence, and how they can access space, and for firstly, as we come out of lockdown through the various phases, but secondly, if we are to experience and hopefully we don't, but if we were to experience a spike later on in the year, as some scientists are saying as a possibility, and we go back into lockdown, how could it be done differently if that was to happen? And I know some of that's been covered, convener, but I was wanting to raise that point again.
Sure. Thank you for that, Fulton. Can I come to Marcia Scott first, please? Marcia.
One of the, I think it's important to acknowledge the difficulty for everybody, police, government, ourselves, and there's been really good response in some ways, fast and flexible, certainly on the part of the Equality Unit. I need to give them their due on that. But I would say that going in and out of lockdown offers some particular challenges, but we have learned some things from the first time, which is the policing messages need to be really clear. I mean, police were very clear that domestic abuse was still a priority, but what wasn't so clear across the piece was that women who were needing to take their children and in order to reduce their harm and risk, whether it's to the park or whether it's to their mothers on public transport, we're allowed to do that and would not be returned home by a police officer, as we know happened down south in a couple of cases. So what we need to be really clear to folks about are what does lockdown for whom? So if it means that you don't expose somebody to the virus, absolutely you should be paying attention. But if you're experiencing domestic abuse, most of those rules don't need to apply to you, and you need to do what you need to do. So that would be one thing we would do very differently. Another thing is really, really working hard to make sure that capacity is available for getting in touch with services, in using technology in which you don't have to worry about being overheard. So web chat, text support, email support, a whole variety of technological solutions that were barely available at the beginning of lockdown. This time will be available, and now the trick is to make sure everybody knows how to use them and can access them. And then the other thing is getting things moving when we're not in lockdown, so that women are not faced with choosing between lockdown with their abuser and being homeless.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful, Marcia. Emma, can I ask for your reflections on Fulton's question, please? Emma.
Thanks. Yes, I think this highlights exactly why we want to think about equality when we make policy. And there are a number of other groups of women who I think were not quite caught up in the first articulation of the message. And so we saw some retail establishments turning away single mothers who had turned up with their children when nobody else was available to care for them. There were some questions about whether carers as well as healthcare workers should also get access to early shopping hours. And, you know, these things are kind of the bread and butter of daily life. So I think the point that we make about impact assessment sounds very much as though we're just very fond of bureaucratic processes. The opposite is true, and we want to see better policy made that really does meet the needs of all people in Scotland. And these are exceptionally challenging times, and like Marcia, I do pay tribute to the officials working in the Equality Unit of Scottish Government. But I think this does speak to a need for more bandwidth across government, across all decision making of government and its agencies and delivery bodies, so that these things are not afterthoughts, that after we've put rules in place, some weeks later we realise that they just don't meet the needs of all people in Scotland, and instead can try and preempt some of these considerations while we're crafting and shaping the rules. And I think that is why our call for emerging from lockdown is that we get it right at the start, because it's much more difficult then to retrospectively change the rules and then try and communicate that to people.
Thank you, that's helpful. Giri, do you wish to add anything on Fulton's question?
Everything that Marcia and Emma said, I agree with that. But also, at the beginning of this lockdown, some of our clients were spotted on, when they were walking on the streets. And I don't know how that could be stopped, because they're just a migrant, and for some reason, they seem to be the cause for the COVID, So I don't know how we can stop that, but that's something I need to bring in. And also, most of our clients are migrant women, and they've received messages from their own home country about COVID, plus the Scottish Government guidelines, which literally confused them. And most of them, not most of them, some of them, a few of them are completely so fearful of coming out, they just lock themselves and their children in the building, in their flat. And also, and so anyway, that we had to work very hard for the women to build her confidence, and for her to believe that it's okay to take a child on the street. It took us a long time. But what I would say, the guidelines are okay, and I think they were in multiple languages as well. But we have women who actually can't read, who are illiterate. And I would appreciate if Scottish Government could give simple guidelines to the agencies that support the women, which could be then given to the women, not given to the women, but you have to go through them personally, and then simple ones, not too complicated ones. That would help if they could give some information to the, for me, it's women's aid services to say, this is what your clients need to know. And even a short video or audio, something like that.
I asked the first panel, there's now in the legislation that regard has to be made to inclusive communication, which would often include things like visuals to go along with written text. So I think that's certainly something that's very important. Can I bring in Pauline McNeill to ask her questions now, please, Pauline?
Thank you very much, Convener. Firstly, can I say to Emma Ritchie, I think that the evidence you gave to the committee earlier is really valuable, and I'm expect nothing less from gender, but I'm really enheartened by that we've identified serious work needs to be done around the dominance of women's issues around COVID. So I don't really have any questions because you covered that really well. I wanted to ask Marsha, Scott, and Gary, whoever's the appropriate person to answer. So we've all been alarmed at the levels of domestic violence during COVID-19. We've all raised it in the chamber. I just wondered, perhaps Ruth McGuire has covered this, but I just wanted to be clearer about what would be the big asks that would contribute to getting these horrendous figures down. So might that be more to be asked of local government, for example, increasing more refuge places? Would that be at the top of your list? Or I'd just really like to know perhaps what maybe your top two asks might be that might contribute to getting that horrible figure down. Thank you.
So we've covered some of this, but I think it's important and we should give panel members the opportunity to come back in. I'll come to Marsha first, please. Marsha.
Thank you, Pauline. I think I would be remiss if I didn't point out that at the end of the day, if we want to stop putting sticking plasters on domestic abuse, whether in a pandemic or not in a pandemic, that domestic abuse is a pandemic of its own, and that at the end of the day, end it. While we need refuge and services, what we really need to do is to choke what I call the feeder system for domestic abuse, which is women's poverty, women's failure to be at the table when decisions are made about the economy or about local housing policy or about any of those things. We need to grasp the nettle of all of the things that Engender points out over and over, because the reality is women have so few choices in the context of domestic abuse because they're constrained by unpaid care, having to find a way to put food on the table for their kids, etc. So I just need to always put that marker down. In terms of what are some big things we could do, I think there's two big things for me. One is to look at the fact that women are really not able to access legal services, and to both because they have a problem in the best of times because of the lack of that legal aid is just really not fit for purpose for domestic abuse cases. But now so many of them have been furloughed that they even if they can get legal aid, they can't find a lawyer. So I think it's we certainly have some ideas. We would really like to work with the government about how to do very rapid testing of some of those in order to create a solution to that can be scaled up. And then I suppose the other big thing is to take a look at this cumulative impact. So, the problem for us about early release is we understand, for instance, about early release of prisoners being about trying to control infection in the prisons. But the reality is, who's then carrying the risk from that? And I can tell you it's women and children. And we've seen some really concerning trends in which, so for instance, I heard this week about a woman, about a service that got a call at, very late on a Friday night because a perpetrator was lifted on Friday night who would have been ordinarily held in custody over the weekend because they didn't want to put him in custody because of infection issues. They released him, and he was going back to the family home, and she had to be moved on an emergency basis because his name was on the tenancy. So there's all kinds of things that we've been trying to get through about making sure that social landlords can evict perpetrators, even if their name is on the tenancy, a whole variety of things that are actually relatively easy to fix, but they need some concentrated attention.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. So you're breaking up a little bit there, but I think we got everything you said. Gary, you have mentioned resource in terms of more workers to support women and access to better communication tools and for the women you work with. Is there anything else you would add to that in response to Pauline McNeill's questions?
I think also to continue to provide accommodation and financial support to the no recourse to public fund women and children. And one more thing, we are expecting a large number of women who are waiting to leave after the lockdown. And we have several women living with their relatives or friends who are planning to leave after the lockdown. So we're expecting a huge demand for the service. And also, I don't think we'll have the resources or the staff to support that, the demand when the women leave. And we have several women who are ready to leave, but after the lockdown.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. One final question. I wonder if we've covered domestic abuse. I wonder if there are other areas of violence against women that might be being exacerbated or getting missed perhaps during this pandemic, such as FGM, and how women and girls who may be at risk from that are being supported at the moment. Giri, can I ask you first before bringing in Emma? I should have brought her in for Pauline's question, but I'll go to you, Giri, on that specific, and then we'll bring in Emma Reach. Giri.
Again, we had several referrals of forced marriage cases from social work and agencies. And all the forced marriage referrals, the survivors are young girls. So they're like school age girls below 20. We also have 2 referrals of potential FGM cases. Again, the FGM cases have no recourse to public funds element in it, but the forced marriage cases are the ones where the children are British. So we are working with them, yes. And for some reason, and I think in the first 2 weeks, we had several forced marriage cases. There's a sudden, hype in the referrals. We are working with them, and we also received referrals from out with Scotland, forced marriage cases. And in this one particular case, they chose for Shakti to support them. They contacted several agencies in England and in Scotland, but at the end of the day, they found Shakti's practice is the best practice, and they're ready to pay us for that support.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Emma, can I bring you back in? Apologies for missing you on the last round, Emma.
Thanks very much, convener. Engender doesn't work a great deal on violence against women, but I would like to flag the concerns raised by my colleagues at Rape Crisis Scotland. who have talked about the fact that they anticipate a significant uptick in demand for their services, and particularly for advocacy services in terms of making complaints to Police Scotland once lockdown is ended. I think I'd also like to highlight the issues around decision making on the plans for judge-led solemn trials. I know Rape Crisis is exceptionally concerned about the fact that without jury trials, serious rape and sexual assault trials will not be able to proceed, and the current alternative proposals that Scottish Government is currently contemplating involving modified jury trials really do not, in Engender's view, seem to have considered a whole range of equality issues, including women's human rights with regards to personal safety and personal physical integrity, but also things around the composition of juries themselves. And we are concerned, there's no right given by the European Convention on Human Rights to trial by jury, and there's certainly no right to a trial by a representative jury. But we think that the alternative proposals are likely to exclude women from participating as jury members, given women's caring roles, likely to be caring for people who are shielding, supervising school-age children even after the schools return, and doing paid work as key workers. And I think we'd again flag up the failure to impact assess. In our view, the impact assessment on the Coronavirus Scotland Bill did not engage with these issues sufficiently, didn't consider the human rights issues, and so we think it's potentially laid a bit of a foundation for women to really be at the margins of decision making about how to respond to the most serious rape and sexual violence offending.
Thank you, that's very helpful. We've got about a minute to let Fulton McGregor in on a quick supplementary on that. Fulton.
Yeah, thanks, convener. It's actually more a point than a supplementary, and I'll be very brief. I sit on the Justice Committee as well, and it's just picking up on what the Justice Committee is looking at the proposals for jury trials. So perhaps it would be worthwhile writing into the Justice Committee, and there's also a Scottish Government working group. I know that Emma will probably be a bit aware of that, but it is something that's been looked at, and there is scrutiny around it, both at the Justice Committee and the working group. So there is options there to pass those concerns through.
Okay, thank you, Fulton. So that now completes our questions and concludes our first evidence session. I'm extremely grateful to all the witnesses who've taken part and shared their knowledge and expertise. It'll be really helpful for the committee moving forward, and thanks to the committee members as well. We didn't lose anyone, so that was good, no gremlins. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. The next meeting of the committee will be scheduled for next week, and this will be notified in the business bulletin via the committee's social media. In the meantime, any follow-up scrutiny issues will be dealt with by correspondence, which will be published on our website. As previously agreed, I now move the meeting into private session.